Today's daf we're going to be learning is Horayot daf Tet. We're going to start with the Mishna at the bottom of Chet Amud Bet. We're just going to review. So we started talking about this korban oleh. That's the sliding scale offering, where depending, right, one does a sin, certain type of sin is one of three options. Either you knew testimony, you swore you didn't, and you lied, or you said you swore I'm going to do something and you didn't, or you went into the temple by accident while you were impure. Okay, or something related, or you ate sacrificial meat or sacrificial items while impure by accident. These are all, again, unwitting. Who is obligated to bring them? So an individual who does this. But the Mishna had said, Rabbi Yosi HaGelili had said, but not the Nasi. Okay, a Nasi is not obligated. Rabbi Akiva had said, the Nasi is actually obligated also to bring a korban oleh, just not if the Nasi testified. Okay, and then we said when we learned the Mishna that when Rabbi Yosi HaGelili says not the Nasi, he also means not the kohen Mashiach. Okay, and right, some people even had the version that it said, and also not the kohen Mashiach. Okay, so according to, we don't yet know what Rabbi Akiva says about the kohen Mashiach, but according to Rabbi Yosi HaGelili, not the Nasi, not the kohen Mashiach, neither of them bring the sliding scale offering. We're going to see more opinions about this later. We're going to learn about Rabbi Shimon's opinion as we go on. I mean, those are the opinions. So Ula tried to understand what the opinion of Rabbi Yosi HaGelili, why is the Nasi and the Kohen Gadol really, but really the Nasi, why is the Nasi out of this parsha? To which they say, well, it said, we attempted this yesterday, it says in this beginning, after mentioning those three sins, if you asham la'echat me'ela, to one of these, and then they said, what does one of these mean? Well, if one, then all. If not one, then not all. And therefore, since the Kohen is not part of the testimony one, the Nasi is not part of the testimony because a Nasi can't testify, then a Nasi is not part of any of them. To which the Gemara suggested, but why don't you say le'echat, to one means to one and maybe not to all the others? It could be one and not the others. So that drasha is rejected. To which the Gemara now answers, starting from the very bottom of Chet Amud Bet, Elatana de Rabbi Yosi HaGelili mehacha. It seems Rabbi Yosi HaGelili learned it from here. Tanya, as it says in a Braita, Rabbi Yirmiyah used to say, Ne'emar lo tigayado, v'ne'emar lo tasigado. Now, when it comes to the sliding scale offering, gives three options. One is an animal, and if lo tigayado, if you can't afford that, then you bring two birds. V'ne'emar lo tasigado, and it says, and if you can't afford that, then we even go lower and we give you an option of a meal offering. What do we derive from this? Misha balidaniyut vashiot. This then means who would bring a sliding scale offering? Only someone who potentially could become either rich or poor. Yatzan Nasi u'Mashiach, and this is where we get that he excludes both the Nasi and the Kohen, she'em ba'im lidaniyut, because neither can become impoverished. How do we know this? Well, Nasi dichtiv, the Nasi, because it says, Va'asa achat mikol mitzvot Hashem elokav. If you do one of the mitzvot of Hashem, Misha ena gabav el Hashem elokav. Now this is what it says in the sacrifice that the Nasi brings, if he does one of the mitzvot of Hashem elokav, right, one of all of them. But what they derive from this is, what it means here is someone, what makes a Nasi, who again is a king, unique, is that ena gabav el Hashem elokav. The only one above the king is God, meaning the king is not dependent on anybody. Now, if the king's not dependent on anybody, that means the king can't be poor, right? So that's how we know that a king can never be poor. Mashiach, dichtiv, ha-kohen gadol me'echav. Okay, the kohen gadol who is greater than his brethren. Shehu gadol. What's the drasha on this? Shehu gadol me'echav. This is, by the way, in Vayikra chapter 21, different section. Hu gadol me'echav b'noi b'koch b'chochma v'osher. We're going to come back to this section later, but right now we're just going to mention this pasuk. He is greater than his brothers in beauty, in strength, in wisdom, and in money, meaning he's wealthier. Achirim omrim, others say, minayin shim ein lo galeu mishalachav. How do you know that? What if he's not wealthy? That they make him wealthy. The brothers, meaning his fellow kohanim, all give him money so that he becomes wealthy. How do we know that? Talmud lomau, v'kohen gadol me'echav asher yitzak al rosho gadleu me'echav. Why does it say kohen gadol me'echav from his brothers? It means he became gadol from his brothers, right? You could read this as he's greater than his brothers. You could also read it as he became great because of his brothers, meaning if he's not wealthy, they make him wealthy. So, in the end, we now say, since this is the reason for Rabbi Yosi HaGelili, why neither of those people bring a korban oleh yored because they can never become poor. And the korban oleh yored is for someone who could potentially become very poor. So now Ravina asked Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak a question. I'll already preface this by saying I'm going to explain this according to Rashi, but there are different possible ways of explaining this. What if a nasi becomes a leper? Meaning the king now can't function as a king because a leper has to be taken out of the community. They can't function as a king anymore. So when they're not functioning as a king, and let's say they sin, do something that would obligate a korban oleh yored, are they obligated or not? Do we say midchadache or mipater patir? So I'm going to explain this according to Rashi. Do we say since the king was a king and the obligation for korban oleh yored was pushed off, it's pushed off completely. Okay, it was removed completely. So even though right now he's not functioning as a king, it doesn't matter. He's exempt. Or mipater patir, or was it just an exemption? While he's the king, he's exempt. When he's not the king, he's back to being obligated. Amar le, to answer the question, Rav Nachman answers the question with a question. And he says, Dilach or de Gaza? Who does the king pay from? His own money? Dilach, our money, your money, which really means communal funds, or de Gaza, or from his own treasury. Obviously from his own treasury. And what was the whole reason why the kohen is exempt according to Rabbi Yosi HaGelili? The king is exempt according to Rabbi Yosi HaGelili? Because he can never become poor. Now, just because he's a leper, he still has his money, and since it anyway would be paid from his own money, therefore he'll still be obligated. Tanya. Now we're going to bring a braita about Rabbi Akiva's opinion, and really about what Rabbi Akiva didn't talk about. Rabbi Akiva said, so while Rabbi Yosi HaGelili exempts the kohen and the king from everything, right, from any korban oleh yored, even though later we're going to understand that Rabbi Akiva maybe means a little bit something else, but he exempts them from, Rabbi Yosi HaGelili exempts from everyone. Forget what I just said a minute ago. Rabbi Yosi HaGelili exempts from everything, but from the korban oleh yored for both the kohen and the king. Rabbi Akiva obligates the king in testimony. Okay, in everything except testimony. Obligates the king to bring the korban oleh yored, just not regarding testimony because the king can't testify. Tanya, Rabbi Akiva, but what he didn't say is, what about the kohen? Mashiach patur mikulan. The kohen Mashiach, right, the anointed kohen, is exempt from all of them. So while he obligates the king in everything that theoretically the king could be obligated in the korban oleh yored, he exempts the kohen. Now the question is going to be why? Amar Rava, my time de Rabbi Akiva. Amar Kra, because he said there's a pasuk that says Ze korban Aaron ubanav. Okay, this is in chapter 6 of Vayikra. It talks about the kohen gadol who's supposed to bring every day minchat chavitin. It's a special meal offering brought twice a day. The kohen gadol brings it from his own money, and it says this is the korban of Aaron and his sons, meaning the kohanim gadolim. Now, because it says the word ze, this, it comes to exclude something else. Zo ba'al chovalo ve'en acheret ba'al chovalo. This is an obligation, but he's exempt from something else. What's that other mincha offering he's exempt from? The korban oleh yored. Okay? And which has a potential mincha offering, right? So the kohen gadol, from there we see, is exempt from the korban oleh yored. So now they say, wait a minute. If it's a mincha coming to exempt a mincha, then maybe the kohen gadol is only exempt from the mincha possibility. The really poor person, right? So, why don't we say, maybe only from the real impoverished person, meaning he won't bring a mincha offering if he has to bring korban oleh yored. He'll have to bring one of the higher ones, or maybe if he's so poor, he doesn't have to bring the meal offering. But if he can afford the birds or he can afford the animal, then he does. Right? What's the dalei dalut? Asirita ifad. That's the 10th of the ifad. That's the mincha. But maybe the Torah wasn't excluding him from the two other possibilities of the animal or the birds. So maybe he still has a partial oleh yored. So basically, we know Rabbi Akiva doesn't hold this because the Braita said he doesn't. But why not? If this is the exemption, maybe it should only exempt from the meal part, the meal offering part. Lo sakadatav. Doesn't seem to be this way. Why? Now, this is very similar to the le'echa me'ela, and we're going to come back to that, where we started today. That's specifically why I went back there. But right now, we're going to darshan a different pasuk. The le'echa me'ela was of the three possibilities of when you were bringing a korban oleh yored. Then it said, and if you sinned with one of these, right, then we had a whole question, is it all or nothing? Or maybe it means possibly one and not the others. But now we're talking about the three options, not of what you were bringing, why you were bringing korban oleh yored, but what you can use for korban oleh yored. So we have animal, 2 birds, or a meal offering. So comes the pasuk, and then at the end of that section, after it talks about the meal offering, it says, "V'chiper alav kohen." This is not the same kohen. The kohen who's doing the korban in the temple does the atonement process for whoever was the sinner. Al chatato asher chata me'achat me'eleh. On his sin that he sinned from one of these options, from the right. So the atonement is achieved, either the animal or the birds or the meal offering. What do they learn from this me'achat me'eleh, from one of these? It's all or nothing. If you can get atonement from one, you get atonement from all. If you can't get atonement from one, you can't get atonement from any of them. That shows that if we derive Zeh korban aron ubanav, comes to say this unique meal offering the kohen gadol brings every day, that's a korban he's obligated in, but not a different one, not the minchat of the korban oleh v'yored. Once we exclude him from the korban oleh v'yored, he's excluded from all the others. And then he doesn't have to bring any of the others, right? So then he's completely excluded, and this is where Rabbi Akiva gets, from that drasha we get, is completely excluded from the korban oleh v'yored. To which the Gemara says, wait, ela me'ata, but if we say that, dichtiv, and now we go back to le'echat, vayaki asham le'echat me'ela. If you take the me'achat to say all for nothing, then the le'achat should be all or nothing. And now, if we say that Rabbi Akiva holds it's all or nothing, there's a problem, because if you say le'achat is all or nothing, if you're not obligated in one of the three reasons, right? One of the three cases that would obligate you in a korban oleh v'yored, like for example, the nasi is not obligated for the shvuat ha'edut, for the testimony, the shmiat kol, if he heard something and didn't testify and swore that he didn't know testimony and he did, the melech is not part of that, then what should Rabbi Akiva say? If he's not part of that, he shouldn't be part of any of them, right? He's never obligated korban oleh v'yored, and that's not what he said. Halamatnam, why does it say Rabbi Akiva Omer nasi chayab chutz mishmiat kol? He is obligated in some and not others. He's obligated in 2 out of the 3 cases. So if you're hold the me'achat drasha is all or nothing, then the le'achat should be all or nothing. So that doesn't make any sense. So then Rabbi Akiva is inconsistent. One time he uses all or nothing, the other time he doesn't. Again, there are 2 different things. One is on which sins you obligate to bring the sacrifice, and the other is which korbanot you bring to atone for the sin. But it should be the same theory. To which Abaye v'Rava Damri Travayo, Abaye and Rava both answer this question. Me'achat mashmaleh, le'achat lo mashmaleh. Okay, they very simply say he holds by the me'achat drasha, he doesn't hold by the le'achat drasha. To which the Gemara is going to say, u'maishna me'achat mashmaleh. So why does he hold by one and not the other? Theoretically, if he holds all or nothing, me'achat le'achat should all be the same. Well, the Katve now he's going to say it's not just that it says me'achat, it's where it puts that pasuk. The Katve rachmana levasof legabe asiri daifa. It basically puts it in which section? After it mentions the meal offering. Okay, why is that important? L'meimra, to tell you the following. It's to say that if you're obligated the meal offering, then you're obligated all of them. And if you're not obligated the meal offering, like the kohen gadol, then you're not obligated in any. Now, why would he say it specifically here? Well, if you want to take the opposite drasha, which is one of these, and it doesn't have to be all of them, you could be obligated one and not the other, well, then it should have put it when? Not after the one the kohen's exempt from, but after one of the ones the kohen is obligated in, and then you would have said, oh, it could be just you're obligated in one and not the others. Right? It should have been in the middle one, or in the rich person's one. So the fact that they put it all the way at the end, after the exempt one, means that it's saying, oh, if you're exempt from one, you're going to be exempt from all of them. As opposed to saying, maybe if you're obligated in one, you still could be obligated in one and not the others, but then it would have had to come earlier, next to one of the obligation ones, and not the ones where the kohen is obviously exempt. And from there we learn it's all or nothing, specifically for this issue. Now we move to the next Mishna, which is a summary Mishna. Okay, but in summarizing, we're going to get at the end of the summary to basically the korban oleh v'yored, and we're going to see some things that are a little different from what we saw previously. Right now we have 2 opinions about korban oleh v'yored, just to be very clear. We have Rabbi Yosi HaGelili, who says the kohen and the king are not obligated at all in the korban oleh v'yored. We have Rabbi Akiva, who says the king is obligated, just not in the shmiat kol, in the testimony one, and the kohen is not obligated at all. And that we just had. Where did we get it from? Zeh korban aron, and not another one. Once he's not obligated in one, he's not obligated in all. That was what we just proved. Comes the Mishna now and goes back all the way to the beginning of this whole idea of a korban chatat, which korbanot and who's obligated what. So it starts with the basic. Kol mitzvot shebetorah shechayavin az donan kareh b'al shigartan chatat Hayachid mevi kispa usira, hanasi se'ir u'mashiach u'beitim mevi'im pal. This is a classic case of a sin offering. When are sin offerings brought? It's something that, right, a chatat, it's brought when? If you intentionally did it, you get karet. If you did it unwittingly, you bring a sin offering. And then, what sin offering would you bring? It depends who you are. The yachid, an individual, brings the kispa or se'ira, which is the female sheep or the female goat. The nasi brings a se'ir, a male goat. The mashiach, the kohen, and the beit din, who sin, right? If the beit din teaches something incorrectly, then a par is brought, the bull offering. Uba avodah zarah, if it's an idol worship, then we know the yachid, hanasi, vehamashiach meviim sira. There's a special se'ira that's brought, not for the same for the individual, the nasi or the mashiach. And the beit din brings a par v'se'ir. Par la'olah v'se'ir l'chatat. So the beit din then has to bring the par and the se'ir. We saw this all before. So that, by the way, we're going to see is really the main case where you bring a par hilim davar shel tzibur, which is our whole topic. Okay? It has to be that the sin is something which, if you did it intentionally, you get karet, and therefore, when you do it unwittingly, you bring this chatat, and that's when you would have a case for par hilim davar shel tzibur. Asham talui. What's an asham talui? Let's say. Okay, so the classic case we usually say is chelev. Okay, that's a case where if you did intentionally, you get karet. By accident, you bring a chatat. What if, I'm not sure, I ate something, I'm not sure it was chelev or fat, right? Forbidden or permitted fat. So, what do? Well, if I want to get atonement in the meanwhile, till I figure it out, I bring what's called an asham talui. When I find out that I actually did something wrong, then I actually have to bring a chatat. And if I find out I did nothing wrong, then I'm fine. But until that point, I want to get atonement. What if I never find out? So the asham talui basically carries me. It's like a hanging guilt offering, provisional guilt offering. So who's obligated in that? A yachid, v'hanasi chayavim, u'mashiach u'beitim ptulim. So actually, a kohen gadol never brings an asham talui, and the court doesn't bring an asham talui, meaning there's no par hilim davar shel tzibur if we're not sure if they sinned or not. Okay? But the individual and the nasi do. We're going to get back to this. Why is the Mashiach exempt from this? Asham vadai. What about there's 5 cases where you bring a korban asham. This is totally different from an asham talui. There's a korban asham if you, certain cases of stealing, me'ila. Okay, there's a bunch of cases, shivcha charufa and some others. Hayachid, v'hanasi, v'hamashiach chayavim. So if someone were to sin and they're an individual or a king or a kohen, they're all obligated. Ubeitim pturim, but again, there's no par hilim davar shel tzibur. Remember, there's only on that first case we saw. What about korban oleh v'oleh? Al shmiat kol, al bitois patayim. This goes back to our previous Mishna. V'al tumat mikdash v'kodashav. Those 3 that are korban oleh v'oleh, the sliding scale offering. Beitim pturim. There is no par hilim davar shel tzibur. Hayachid v'hanasi v'hamashiach chayavim. Okay, so now we see a third opinion, or maybe it's not exactly a third opinion we're going to see, but it seems to be a third opinion, that the Yachid, the Nasi, and the Mashiach are Chayavim. Now, the Nasi part really matches Rabbi Akiva, because no one's going to think the Nasi is Chayav on Shmiat Kol, but he's just put here because he's Chayav on all the rest. And the Mashiach is Chayav. That's a unique opinion. We haven't seen that yet. Both Rabbi Yosi HaGelili and Rabbi Akiva thought the Mashiach, the kohen, is not Chayav. Ella, he just has one exemption for the Mashiach. Just not on accidental impurity. We're going to have to understand why. This is derived Rabbi Shimon. This is a new opinion, Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Now they assume Rabbi Shimon holds by Rabbi Akiva about the king, about the aid, because also Rabbi Shimon was Rabbi Akiva's student. Umahim mivi'in, so what do they bring when they're obligated? Korban oleh v'yored. Rabbi Eliezer or maybe Rabbi Eliezer, there's a difference in Girsa. Hanasi maybe se'ir. Okay, so we have a debate here, and we're going to have to see what exactly Rabbi Eliezer is talking about, but it sounds like he's talking about the Nasi brings a se'ir. If he's chayav a korban oleh v'yored, he's chayav, but he brings his own unique korban. He doesn't bring the sliding scale offering. He will be obligated for the 3 things or maybe 2, right? Not the shmiat kol, but the bitois vatayim tumat mikdash v'kodashav. But he'll bring a se'ir, his unique, that's the unique korban for the nasi. For the korban chatat, he'll bring that also for the oleh v'yored. That's also a unique opinion. That they're not obligated, the oleh v'yored, they are obligated, but their korban is unique. Okay, but that's just the nasi. And the opinion before Rabbi Eliezer thinks they're chayav the korban oleh v'yored, then they bring the oleh v'yored. Okay. Now we're going to get to the Gemara. We're going to bring a bright about Rabbi Shimon. Tanya. Rabbi Shimon hayano ten klal. Rabbi Shimon would give this following principle, rule. Kol shayachid asham talui, hanasi kayotze bo. If the yachid is obligated in asham talui, the nasi is also obligated in asham talui. So in a case where the yachid ate chalev and wasn't sure if it was chalev or not, brings an asham talui. Also, the nasi does the same thing. He also does this. By the way, we saw in the Mishna. Mashiach hu beitim pturim, but the Mashiach and the beitim don't bring. So the kohen, the gadol, and the beitim don't bring an asham talui. V'koshu ba'asham vadai, and if it's an asham vadai, this by the way matches what we saw in the Mishnah. If it's a asham yilod and all that, nasi u'mashiach kayotze ben, they bring just like an individual would, but the beitim is pturim. There's just no beitim, but everyone else is obligated. Shmiat kol will be twice fatayim v'tumat mikdash v'kodashav, the threesome of the korban oleh v'yored. Beitim pturim, this is really just a review. We'll see the one big thing that we're going to get to in a minute that differs. But beitim pturim, the court has no obligation, and the korban oleh v'yored, if the court mistakenly taught something. Nasi u'mashiach chayavim, ela she'ena nasi chayav b'shmiach kol v'lo mashiach b'tumat mikdash v'kodashav. Here you have it explicitly, the part they missed in the Mishnah, which is, even though we said it, which is the nasi isn't obligated about testimony, and the kohen is not obligated to tumat mikdash v'kodashav. That part we already saw in the Mishnah. Kol shehu ba'oleh v'yoreh, but here comes the big complicated sentence in the Spraita. Anyone who's chayav in an oleh v'yored, nasi kayotze bo, mashiach hu beitim pturim. But whenever there's an obligation of a sliding scale offering, the nasi is like an individual, and the kohen and the beitin are exempt. Now, a minute ago we just said the kohen's obligated, just not in tumat mikdash v'kodashav. So obviously there's an internal contradiction here in the Braita, to which the Gemara says, Haguf Akasha, this whole Braita makes no sense. A minute ago you said that kohen wasn't obligated in the tumat mikdash v'kodashav, but from there it sounds like tumat mikdash v'kodashav only in that one case is the kohen exempt. But b'shmiat kol will be twice fatayim chayav. But in the other two cases of oleh v'yored, he would be chayav. And yet in Maseifa, it says in the end, kol shu b'oleh v'yored nasi kayotze bo mashiach hu beitim pturim. Right? If it's an oleh v'yored, the mashiach is exempt. Katani mashiach hu beitim pturim, ma beitim pturim mikulam, not mashiach pturim mikulam. Right? The beitim is exempt in all three cases. So if the mashiach is just like the court, he should be exempt in all three cases. So kashin adadi, these two sentences completely contradict. To which Amar Rav Huna b'rei Rabbi Yoshua, turning out Amud Bet, Rav Huna b'rei Rabbi Yoshua says lo kasha. Kam b'dalut, kam b'dalei dalut. Now we're going to see that there's a way to understand this. When we say the kohen is exempt completely in all three cases, what do we mean? Not exempt completely. Exempt from the meal offering. The kohen will never bring the meal offering, and that's because of that whole drasha about the meal offering. This meal offering, yes, some other meal offering, never will bring the meal offering for the really poor, but b'dalut, but he could bring the middle one, the birds, and obviously also the animal. Okay? For Rabbi Shimon, Savar like Rabbi Akiva b'chadu, palagale b'chadu. So he partially holds like Rabbi Akiva, just not completely. Savar like Rabbi Akiva b'dalei dalut patur. He agrees with Rabbi Akiva that it will never bring the meal offering, upalagale b'dalut, but he does think that a kohen could theoretically bring the middle or the higher offering of the oleh v'yored, just not for tumat mikdash v'kodashav. Okay? That he agrees that it's completely exempt. Now we have to get to what's the logic behind Rabbi Shimon. Why, if he thinks the kohen gadol is part of korban oleh v'yored, why does he disqualify him and say, or not disqualify, but exempt him from the tumat mikdash v'kodashav if he accidentally goes into the temple while impure or eats sacrificial meat while impure? So ela she'en kohen gadol chayav b'tumat mikdash v'kodashav, etc. Amar Chizkiah. So Chizkiah says, "My time of Rabbi Shimon." What's his reason? Dichtiv, as it says. Now here we're quoting a pasuk in Bamidbar Yud Tet, where it says, now here it's talking in the Para Aduma section about if somebody doesn't get themselves purified and they go into the temple impure, if they do it intentionally, they will get karet. But it says here they're going to get karet from within the community. These are the words we're going to darshan. Misha korbano shaveh lekahal. It's a little bit tricky, this section. If they have the same korban as the community, what makes someone mitoch hakahal? When are you going to be obligated here? Now, the obligation here is if you did it intentionally, but we're going to move it to what if you did it unintentionally? When are you obligated korban, oleh v'yored? If your korban is like everyone else's. Now, what korban of the kohen is not like everyone else's? Now, we're not talking about the unique korban chatat, even though theoretically we could have. But we're talking about on Yom Kippur. If you remember on Yom Kippur, there's a bull offering that the kohen brings. It's actually for himself. And he also does confession there for all the other kohanim. We'll get back to that in a minute. But right now, let's just focus on This is a unique korban. By the way, if you remember, in Shavuot, we learned about this when we learned about all the Yediyot Tumah and all that there was a whole question about which korban goes for what and which one covers Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav, and that some of these korbanot, these unique korbanot in Yom Kippur, were specifically for impurity in the temple, which all the more so connects to here. But putting that issue aside, let's just stick with what it says here. So now they're going to say, the kohen gadol is different. Okay, we're going to say he's not mitoch HaKahal, and therefore he's excluded from Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav. Now, even though that pasuk was about intentional sin, we're going to apply it to unintentional. Since he has a unique korban on Yom Kippur, okay, and therefore he's not considered mitoch HaKahal because his unique korban sets him aside. Okay, Gemara is going to question that. Im ken, well, if that's the case, Nasi nami ein korbano shavel HaKahal. The Nasi also has his own unique korban. Now we're moving back to the korban chatat. The Nasi has his own unique korban chatat. He also stands alone. So they say, okay, it's true he has his own unique korban chatat, but but on Yom Kippur, he gets atonement along with all the other people. Okay, so basically we're going to say it's the Yom Kippur korban that distinguishes for this purpose. Okay, well, if it's the Yom Kippur, so why don't we say Kohanim also have their own unique korban because they get atoned for by the bull offering of the Kohen Gadol? So why don't we say that also the Kohanim are not part of the Kahal for Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav, and they wouldn't bring a korban oleh v'yorei? Now nobody says that. They only say the Kohen Gadol is exempt. So that's because Kohanim shavu l'kal bishar mitzvot d'shana kulan. And what they say here is they're like everyone else regarding. Now here you have to add a little bit more, otherwise it becomes hard to explain this. And this is what Rashi adds. For the rest of mitzvot in the entire year means that if the Kohanim sinned with the rest of the people, with the paralim davar shel tzibor, let's say the court ruled an erroneous ruling and they did with everyone else, they'd be obligated like everyone else. And that's why they're considered like everyone else, to which they say, what do you mean? If it's exactly the same, if we use the paralim davar shel tzibor as our model, Mashiach nami hashaveh b'shar mitzvot d'shana. The Kohen Gadol is also the same, by the way. If the Kohen Gadol sins with the rest of the community, based on erroneous ruling of the court, the Kohen Gadol doesn't bring his own unique korban, so then they should, right? So basically, if you're going to say that doesn't mean exemption, well then the Kohen Gadol shouldn't be exempt from Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav either, because he's just like the Kohanim. So that didn't really work, that whole section, because it all ended up saying in the end, in order to say, if we're splitting it all Yom Kippur down the line, then Kohen and Kohanim should all be exempt from the Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav, and that's not true. And if we say, well, if they included in paralim davar shel tzibor, then they're included in Kahal, well, then the Kohen Gadol would also be. So Elam, Rava Emahachi. Rava says we have to change it a little bit. What it meant to say is, Misha chatato shavel yichidim umayniu kahal. Okay, let's just read this backwards. What is a kahal? A kahal is made up of individuals. So when it says mitocha kahal, they mean anyone who's like being part of the kahal because they're treated like individuals. Now, what does it mean they're treated like individuals? As regards a korban chatat. Now here, if we remember, Daf Zayin Amud Bet, we had this whole thing that the Kohen, the Nasi, for example, brings a korban chatat in the exact same situation where Yechi brings. Now he brings a different korban, but it's the exact same situation. A king eats chaylev by accident, doesn't realize it's chaylev, or the people eat chaylev by accident. They're obligated to korban chatat. So it's true, the Nasi brings a different korban, but brings it in the same way. The Kohen Gadol is only chayav this unique korban, otherwise he's exempt. If he eats chaylev by accident, he's exempt. He's only chayav to bring the Kohen's unique korban if it's modeled like the paralim davar shel tzibor. He accidentally ruled wrong and went with his erroneous ruling. So because he doesn't have a chatat like the yachid, because he wouldn't bring it if he just ate chaylev by accident, therefore he's different from the kahal. He stands apart. Again, going back to that pasuk, v'nichrita nefesh hahi mitoch hakahal, and that's about Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav. So the Kohen Gadol is excluded from Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav. Now we go to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Hanasi mevi se'il. Now we have to explain what's left with. Okay, maybe I should just summarize until now. We have Rabbi Yosi HaGelili, who says neither the Nasi nor the Kohen brings korban oleh v'yorei, completely exempt. That's because they'll never become poor. So since they're not part of that, they're not part of anything. We have Rabbi Akiva, who said the Nasi could bring, just not the one about testimony, but he could bring a korban oleh v'yorei. However, the Kohen Mashiach doesn't bring, and that's from that unique exception, Ze korban. right? Only he brings this minchat, not the other. And once he's not bringing the minchat, he's not going to bring any of them. Because once he's exempt from one, he's exempt from all. It's the all or nothing. Then we went to Rabbi Shimon, who basically says both the kohen and the nasi are obligated. Just the nasi, he agrees with Rabbi Akiva, is not obligated in the edut one. And the kohen is not obligated in tumat bitash v'kodashav, and that's because of that unique pasuk, where it actually was talking about intentional and not unintentional, but there it said mitoch kahal, it has to be someone who's treated like the kahal for their korban chatat yachid. Okay? And the kohen gadol is not. He has unique laws, and therefore he's an exception. Just for tumat mikdash v'kodashav. So that's a unique opinion. Until now, nobody had said that the kohen Mashiach brings a korban oleh v'yored. He thinks you do, as long as it's not the tumat mikdash v'kodashav one. Now we have Rabbi Eliezer, who said hanasi mevi seir. So now the question is, in what case does the nasi bring a seir? Is it in all cases where the nasi has to bring a korban oleh v'yored? Is it in, right, what are we talking about? So again, if you look back at the Mishna for a quick minute, the Mishna had said, right, Rabbi Shimon had come and said that the nasi is chayav on shmiat kol b'tois fatayim tumat mikdash v'kodashav, and they bring a korban oleh v'yored, and Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Eliezer said a nasi mevi seir. Now, it sounds like nasi brings seir for all three of those cases, but comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, no. I'm Rabbi Yochanan, lo, I'm Rabbi Eliezer, ela b'tumat mikdash v'kodashav. Why? Why would it be only in that case he brings his own unique korban, which sounds like he brings in all the others, the regular korban oleh v'yored? Just in the case of tumat mikdash v'kodashav, he brings the unique korban for the nasi, for the king. Ho'il v'ne'amar karet bo ki b'kvu'ah. Because that's the only one of the three that is associated with intention. If it was done intentionally, you'd have karet, as we just saw. And since you'd have karet, we're going to treat it like the classic korban chatat, where if you did something that intentionally you're chayav karet, unintentionally you bring a sin offering. So the nasi has his own unique sin offering. Where shmiat kol and b'shuvat b'itoy, there's no karet associated with it if you did it intentionally. So there, we're going to just go with the regular korban oleh v'yored. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa now wants to prove this, and then we're going to have a discussion about whether his proof is good or not. Hachinami mistaber, it actually makes sense to say that. If he really meant on all of them, the nasi has his own unique korban, doesn't bring the oleh v'yored. He is chayav an oleh v'yored, but brings his own unique korban on all three cases. Michti seir v'nasi upar Mashiach b'mkom yachid l'chatat kai. Okay, that's a big mouthful, which really just means the seir of the nasi, right? The goat offering of the nasi and the bull offering of the kohen are bimkom yachid l'chatat kai, are all equal. There's an analogy. The seir for the king, the bull for the kohen, and the chatat, the regular sin offering, kisbaru seirah, the female goat or female sheep, for the individual, right? Those two, the par and the seir of the kohen and the nasi, are in place of the individual regular sin offering. In which case, if he thinks that in all three cases of the korban oleh v'yored, the nasi brings his unique seir offering, then wouldn't you think he would say the kohen brings the par? Okay, nitne nami, it should have said Mashiach mevi par b'shmiat kol u'b'tois fatayim, right? On the two that he obligates the kohen Mashiach, which is all of them except for tumat mikdash v'kodashav, he should have said, and the Mashiach brings the par. The fact that he ignores the kohen Mashiach here, why would he ignore him? Only because he must be talking about the case where the kohen is exempt, which is tumat mikdash v'kodashav, and that's why he thinks, right? Shema mina tumat mikdash v'kodashav kai Mashiach patur. He must have not mentioned the Mashiach there because it must be the case that the Mashiach is exempt. It doesn't even bring a korban. And that's tumat mikdash v'kodashav, so it must be the nasi brings a seir specifically in the case where it's the king is where the kohen gadol is exempt entirely. So that's his proof. It's a bit of a weird proof, but it's a proof. It's potential. But Amalei Rav Huna B'rei Rav, not tell the Rav Papa. He says, "Mimai Dilma Rabbi Eliezer a kulam kai." No, you could read it as he's talking about all of them, really. Uba Mashiach sever like Rabbi Akiva damar Mashiach patur miklum. Maybe he holds by the kohen Mashiach that the kohen Mashiach is actually exempt in all, and that's why he didn't mention the Mashiach. We don't know what Rabbi Eliezer says about that. He never talks about it. Maybe he holds like Rabbi Akiva that the kohen is actually exempt. And Rabbi Yosi HaGelili, by the way, everyone said the kohen, but they say maybe he holds like Rabbi Akiva. Mashiach is exempt, and that's why he didn't mention the Mashiach. Amalei. Now here comes the big clincher, and this is going to end this section. Who says that Rabbi Akiva thinks that the Mashiach is completely exempt? Now we thought until now, Rabbi Yosi HaGelili said the kohen's exempt, Rabbi Akiva said the kohen's exempt, we assumed he meant exempt completely. The kohen does one of the three sins, there's no korban at all. And that's right, that's what we thought. he says, Rabbi Akiva mi patro le mi pal. Wait, you're assuming, the whole thing, why didn't he mention and the Mashiach brings a par? Because maybe he holds like Rabbi Akiva, the kohen doesn't have to bring a par, but what do you mean? When Rabbi Akiva says the kohen is exempt from bringing a korban oleh yored, he meant from the sliding scale offering. But if he does one of those three things, he's obviously obligated to bring a korban. And what korban does he bring? The par, the unique korban for the kohen. So if you say that Rabbi Eliezer holds like him, he would have to have actually said, and the Mashiach brings a par. So the fact that he didn't say it really does prove for Papa that he must be talking about the case where the kohen Mashiach isn't obligated at all, which is Tumah Mikdash for Kodashav, and then he doesn't really hold like Rabbi Akiva there. Vitulo midi, and there's no more to be said about this sugya. It's an interesting way to end, especially when we brought up a radical comment here that instead of what we thought all along, the kohen doesn't bring any korban at all. According now to the way the Gemara understands Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva actually says you don't bring the korban oleh yored. There's no sliding scale offering, but of course, if you do one of the three things that anyone would be obligated to sliding scale offering, if you're a kohen, you go gadol, the high priest, you would bring it. You would just bring a par, not the sliding scale one. And that's a unique, right? It's different than the way we read it until now, and it seems like that's the way the Gemara concludes. That is a fact. Okay, so in the end, we're back to saying that what Rabbi Yochanan said about Rabbi Eliezer seems to be true, that when Rabbi Eliezer said the Nasi brings a seir, he's only talking about in the Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav, and that's why he didn't mention, and the kohen brings a par, because there is no par in that case. Kohen's exempt completely. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Modeh Rabbi Eliezer she'ein mevi asham. So Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Eliezer agrees, by the way, with what was said before, that an asham talui, it doesn't say that, but that's what they mean. A Nasi would never bring an asham talui. If a Nasi is not sure if he ate chalev, he wouldn't bring an asham talui. Tane kamei Rav Sheshet. Now, Tana brought a braita before Rav Sheshet. I just want to check one thing. Asham talui yachi. Sorry. Yachiv and Nasi chayavim we saw in the Mishna. Okay, so he's disagreeing and saying that the Nasi, right, even though it doesn't say Nasi here, they assume that the Nasi would bring a korban asham. So even though he's not obligated he brings his own unique par for the korban oleh yored, he would bring an asham talui. Tana kamei Rav Sheshet. So Tana brings it right before Rav Sheshet. Asham talui baal tumat mikdash v'kodashav. Okay, you would bring an asham talui on if you weren't sure if you accidentally went into the temple when you were impure or not. Amar le d'amar lachmani. Who holds that way? To which he answered, Rav Sheshet the Tana who brought it answers Rabbi Eliezer. D'amar ho'il v'ne'amar bo karet kebikvuah maite seir nasi aleha. Okay, he says, this much matched Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Why? What did Rabbi Eliezer say? Since it says karet, it's treated, right? This is different from the other two of the korban oleh yored. It's like a regular korban chatat. Now, if it's like a regular korban chatat, that would be equated with you bring an asham talui on that. Because once it's like a regular chatat, then you'll bring an asham talui if you're not sure if you did it or not. But then they say, how could you say that? Because Hamar Rabbi Yochanan Modeh Rabbi Eliezer she'ein mevi asham talui. But what you just said disagrees with what Rabbi Yochanan said, to which they answer kasha. Because again, Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabbi Eliezer holds you don't bring an asham talui if you're a king. And according to this braita, you would bring an asham talui. So they end with, that's how we end the chapter, with a kasha. And with that, Hadran alacho rekohim Mashiach. And with that, we finish our chapter. Okay, quick review before we're just going to finish up with the next Mishna, but I want to do a quick review of the daf before we move on to a new topic and finish the daf, which is we have the main topic, even though we did a summary of really everything, our main topic was really this korban oleh yored, and we saw a slew of opinions, is the kohen and the melech not chayav at all, and that's because they can never become poor, so there's no sliding scale offering for them. Is it that just the nasi, the king has to bring, but the kohen not, and that's from the minchat chavitin drasha? Or is it that actually they're both obligated, just each one has its own exception, right? Even the nasi, when he was obligated, always has the exception of the edut one, the testimony one, and that the king has the kohen has the exemption of tumah mikdash v'kodashav. Okay, and that we had, again, an explanation as to where we got to that exemption from. Okay, that was the main thing of what we did. Now we're just going to finish up with the next Mishnah. And then we just had this unique opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said actually the Nasi is obligated, but brings his own korban. That was the whole way of looking at it, which then we went back and said even Rabbi Akiva holds that way, by the way, right? That even though Rabbi Akiva exempts the kohen actually brings a par. Okay? Kohen Mashiach shechata, new Mishna, new chapter. The Kohen Mashiach that sins, v'achar kach avar mimshichuto, and then became impure and is no longer the Kohen gadol. Or v'chein nasi shechata, v'achar kach avar migdulato, or a king who sins and then stopped being king. Kohen Mashiach may be par, v'nasi may be seer. Because they were obligated when they were the Kohen gadol, when they were the king, they're still obligated to bring the unique korban. But Mashiach shavar mimshichuto, v'achar kach chata. But what if someone was a king and then someone was a Kohen Gadol and then sinned after he was already no longer a Kohen Gadol? Or a king who was a king and then stopped being king, and then, so if the sin happened after they were no longer in their position, here we're going to have a distinction. With that, we're going to finish for today. Kohen Mashiach mevi par. The Kohen is always the status of Kohen Gadol, even though he's no longer Kohen Gadol. You don't you always go up in sanctity, you never go down. Still has a sanctity as Kohen Gadol, and therefore will still bring the par. However, the Nasi Kedyot, the Nasi is like a regular person. Now a king is no longer a king, it just goes back to being a regular person, and therefore brings a regular korban chatat, not the special unique one for the Nasi. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.